Okay, you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM and on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHMWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Dr. Jeffrey Carroll of Chestnut Hill College to discuss voter participation in areas experiencing poverty. Election attorney Larry Otter will walk us through the world of petition challenges. We're in the midst of that right now. We have some news about that. And our own Denise Clay-Murray will give us a preview of her Friday column. What we're going to start off with tonight, however, is our interview with Larry Otter, election attorney. All right, Mr. Otter, thank you so much for being with us.
Good morning.
So can you, before we get into the petition process and how all that works, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I've done election stuff starting in the late 80s when I actually ran for office in Bucks County. And then in this century, I've limited my practice to election matters and constitutional issues surrounding First Amendment political speech. I've handled innumerable election-related questions, a lot dealing with petitions, both prosecuting a challenge and defending challenges. I've represented Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, the Green Party, Independents, and the Socialist Workers.
Okay. So how does the petition process work for people who aren't familiar with it?
Well, to get ballot access, you have to, in Pennsylvania and a lot of other states, you have to circulate nominating petitions for the primary, that's the Democrats and Republicans. If you're a third party or independent, you circulate nomination papers, which is basically a document almost identical to a nomination petition. Slight differences, but for the sake of this discussion, I'll just talk about the nomination petitions for Democrats and Republicans. The election code specifies by office how many signatures you need. In Philadelphia, it's the only first-class city in the state, in the Commonwealth, excuse me. You normally have to get 1,000 signatures for any office, except for district council, you only need 750. In reality, you need 2 or 3 times that. It's been my experience in doing petition work all over the state. I mean, from Philadelphia to Erie and every place in between. The error rate for petitions, and this is just common mistakes, like you're not a registered voter, you're not registered in the district, you're not registered at your address that's in the SURE system. There's approximately 30% error rate. If I get to a candidate before the petition process starts, I highly recommend that they get a street list and do it that way. It's a little more time consuming, but they're gold-plated signatures as far as most people are concerned, because you have the record right in front of you when you knock at the door and you know that they're a Democrat or a Republican. In Philadelphia, the error rate tends to be 50%. For a whole host of reasons. Most of them common. A lot of times, candidates and politicians like to throw around, there was fraud on the petitions. That's baloney. It's usually just a common mistake. Meaning, the person's not registered in that party. They don't live in the district. They're not registered at that address. They forget to fill in a line, forget to put in a date. A common mistake is somebody will put in the zip code instead of a date, and then the next 5 people down the line will put the zip code in. Well, you can just strike those lines from a petition. It's a tedious process, and it's done in the dead of a Pennsylvania winter. When I talk about the subject, I mentioned I was circulating a petition for Governor Casey, I guess in 1990 in Lower Bucks County at the Bristol Pathmark, I think, as I recall. It was a really cold day. And silly me, I only brought one pen. Within a half an hour, my pen froze. I had to go into the store, buy a pack of big pens, come back outside and start all over again with a new pen. That froze in a half an hour. So I was swapping out pens the entire morning I was there. Once you collect at least the minimum number, you can then file your petition with the appropriate authority. It's either, if you're running for any state office, that includes all the judge races, you have to file in Harrisburg. Any city or local race, you have to file in the county with the Board of Elections. And one of the things that's part of the package, you have to file your nominating petitions with with at least the minimum number of signatures. You have to file a statement of financial interest, and you have to file a candidate's affidavit. Those latter two documents can also cause you a lot of problems. In this cycle, there are a number of people who neglected to, the candidate's affidavit is the only document that has to be notarized. At one time, every petition page had to be notarized. That's the courts started eliminating that. And then when they revised the election code in 2019, they took that out. So just you sign an or you sign the sign as the circulator, and you agree to be subject to process if the petition is challenged and you have to be subpoenaed. The other thing that causes problems is the statement of financial interest. I don't know who devised that form, but when I worked for the state, I was at the Attorney General's office and the Pennsylvania Department of Health for a few years. We had to fill out those forms every year, and it would take me at least 4 attempts to fill it out properly. It's a hideously designed form, but what they're looking for is any potential conflicts of interest you might have. That form, when you're a candidate, you have to file a copy of that form with your petitions, and then if you're running for state office, you have to go file the original with the state ethics office. I believe you can do that online now. And if you're running for local office, you have to file it with the governing body's office, like the county commissioners. In Philadelphia, there's a clerk of records office, so it has to be filed. 4 years ago, Darrell Clark forgot whoever he sent down to file his petitions forgot to file the statement of financial interest with the clerk's office just down the hall from where they filed it. He came within 15 minutes of getting bounced off the ballot 4 years ago. So and that's a fatal mistake. There's no way around that. If you're challenged, you are DOA on that issue.
Okay. So what are some of the things that are commonly challenged in addition to signatures? Can it be the forms? And how does that work?
Well, a typical challenge is a page and line thing. You have to be precise. And the Commonwealth Court has issued a standing order, as has the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. They also have a standing order about this type of, you have to list page 1, line 1, the signatures challenged for not registered in district, not registered, not a registered Democrat, or other. If you do other, you have to then specify what that is. But there's a list of about 12 things that are standard challenges that can be found in those standing orders by the Commonwealth Court and the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. If you can also challenge the candidate's affidavit, one of the things that I've seen what's your occupation? That's also on the preamble to your nomination petition. The a couple of cases arose in the last 10 years dealing specifically with the occupation. And in one case, a candidate for state rep put down that he was a lawyer. However, he was not a lawyer. He was a law student who had taken the bar, and the results were not out yet. So the Supreme Court took a really dim view of that. I believe in the Bob Gazzardi case, he was challenging Tom Corbett in the Republican primary. He put down, he was also a member of the bar, but he was retired. And they got him on something else, but as a side note, they mentioned that, oh, by the way, you're not a lawyer, you're retired. The courts really hammered those people on those particular issues. So you have to be, to me, it's not that difficult, but given all the new job titles we have of people who are in the computer business, I've seen some strange things that, well, okay, I have no idea what that is, but if you tell me that's what you do, okay.
Well, and something just popped into my mind. This is a question Denise and I had last week. So if somebody submits petitions that are obviously not solid, maybe it's the same handwriting on every form, something like that. Is there an
Just as a
internal
little
mechanism?
aside on that particular thing, you can hold a petition at arm's length, once you've done this for a while, and in the hand of another, meaning somebody writes the same information, or the legendary kitchen table jobs, they just jump off the page at you. You can see the identical handwriting. It's not that difficult.
But if they're not challenged, are they just accepted, and there isn't a mechanism internally to say, well, no, we can't accept these?
They have to be challenged. What happens at the Board of Elections or the State Department is they review the petitions. They'll take off facial defects, like if a line's incomplete or somebody drew a line through that line, striking the signature. What they basically do is they count to the minimum that's required, and then just say, okay, you have enough. You have your other documents, and you have a cashier's check for the filing fee. You're on the ballot. Then you have 7 days to challenge those petitions. So everybody works at a breakneck pace looking at the petitions. Anybody who comes in less than, like if you needed 250 signatures out in the counties to run for judge, if you come in with 275, I guarantee your petition will be challenged, because under the otter 30% rule, you're not going to have enough signatures. And that usually plays out correctly. The best challenges are the ones that are based on the review of the records in the SURE system. That's the statewide uniform registry of electors. That you're not registered in the party, you're not registered, period. You're not a registered Democrat or registered Republican, as the case may be. Those signatures are dead on.
I think your audio cut out there for a second. Oh, there we go.
Oh, sorry about that. The in hand of another or illegible, those are always coin tosses. You like to see the ones that are, as they say, hard challenges to things that can be resolved by looking at the card in the SURE system. If it comes down to the signatures, that's also part of the voter registration card. If you've done this a while, you can make an argument without an expert handwriting person that the signature doesn't match what's in the Sure system. A while back, the Department of Transportation, when they had, the motor voter laws, the signatures that came in through that were hideous. And I think anytime I ever challenged one and it came up that the voter registration came through the PennDOT, the judges would just strike the signature. They don't match. The PennDOT has improved the process, but still, scribbling, your signature on a video screen with your fingernail, leaves a lot to be desired. On the other hand, I have seen signatures that have been challenged as illegible, and you're able to find the actual card based on the person's address. They've been dead matches. I mean, things that you couldn't imagine. No, this can't be the person's signature. You pull up the card and sure as hell it is, which always infuriates the other side.
Sure.
But,
okay. I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us.
Sure.
Last week, because Larry and I were sitting in there on Friday listening to all of the petition challenges. One of the things that interested me was when the judge told the people with the people who were challenging that they had to go to Delaware Avenue and try to work this out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That's part of, the standing order in Philadelphia and in the Commonwealth Court for any state offices. You go down to Spring Garden and Delaware Avenue and go to the voter registration office where they keep all the records. They will give you one of their persons to work the computer, and you just look at the page 1, line 1. Here's the information we have, and then you attempt to find that card. And the people who work in the voter registration office are incredibly knowledgeable about every street in Philadelphia. They're sometimes very helpful in finding out, if you can't read the signature, what the street is, and they know that it's north, south, east, west, or whatever. And they will pull up that card, and then you see, are they registered? You look at what the challenge is, and then you would try to agree or say that, no, we'll have to let the judge decide this. Basically, in the one challenge I had, there were over 1,300 signatures. That takes a couple of days to review. And 20 years ago, the judges used to do that themselves in court. Then they got smart and said, no, you guys do this. And if you can't agree, come back here. Well, invariably, if you have two knowledgeable practitioners in election law, you can probably resolve, I would say, at least 50% of the challenges that way. So you've cut the judge's job down in half, at least, if you can't work it out. A lot of times you will see that, either your challenge is going to fail or the candidate doesn't have enough signatures, and everybody just folds their hand at that point. You either withdraw your petition or the candidate withdraws.
Now, if there is a petition challenge and the judge rules that person should be, that challenge is a valid one, can the person who has been challenged appeal that decision? And if so, where and how long do they have?
The normal time period under the rules of civil procedure, I believe, is 20 days. In election law, you have 10. And interestingly, the rules of civil procedure do not apply in election cases because you're looking to do things very quickly. For the obvious reason is the ballots have to be printed and shipped out to the armed forces and people who have requested a mail-in ballot or absentee ballots. So it takes a while to organize each ballot, and you have, I don't know how many different council districts in Philadelphia. So in this go round, you would have at least, I don't know, 10 or 15 different forms of the ballot to fit into each district. When you have state rep races, they're tighter districts. So you're going to have, in Philadelphia, you're going to have a lot more different types of ballots. So and the courts are well aware of that problem. That's why speed is the operative term. At the same time, the court has agreed that we take a liberal view of interpreting these challenges. And if there's a question, the candidate usually gets the benefit of the doubt so that the people can decide if they stay on the ballot.
Okay. Now, were you, when you decided to go to law school, was election law kind of your focus, and how did you get into that?
No. They don't, not too many law schools teach election law. There are a few that will have that as an elective. I went to Temple Law School. We did not have, or at least I was not aware of a course in election law, 40 years ago when I went to Temple. They may have a course in that now. I don't know. It's become a hotter topic for the obvious reason since, at least Bush v. Gore and 2016 and 2020. There are a lot more permutations to this, but like I said, the petition process is without a valid petition, you don't get on the ballot. So that's step one. You got to do that right.
Yes.
Now, having said that, one of the more interesting cases I had in 2016, I represented Governor Kasich, who was governor of Ohio, who was running for president. His petitions were terrible, but the challenge to it was even worse because you have 7 days from the last day to file nominating petitions. You have the right to file a challenge to those nomination petitions. Somebody filed a challenge, but they have to be filed by 5 o'clock in Harrisburg for a presidential race or any other state race like US Senate, Congress, judges, whatever. The individual showed up late you also have to serve the Secretary of State's office by 5 o'clock, personally serve them. So one of the very first cases I did that involved that issue, I made the mistake of FedExing it in that day, and I was quickly disabused of my standing to bring the challenge by the late Greg Harvey, who was the lawyer that's credited with making election law a big deal in Pennsylvania. It's election season, in even numbered years when you're going to have state reps, the governor, presidents, Congress, Senate, stuff like that. I set up shop in Harrisburg in a hotel or an office. So I have my war room is there. All I have to do is walk across the street to the Capitol and then go over to the State Department and the Commonwealth Court to file the necessary paperwork. But in the Kasich matter, the service on the Secretary of State was time-stamped in at 5:13 p.m. Also, the petition that was filed, it was filed electronically. That wasn't filed until, I think, 6:20 p.m. So both were late filings under the election code. You very rarely file motions in election cases. In this case, I did. I filed a motion to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction. The filing with the Secretary of State and the court timely is a jurisdictional requirement. The case never was decided, so it's still an open question: is what does 5 o'clock mean on the 7th day after the end of the petition period? That's yet to be resolved. There are a couple of cases. I'm aware of one right now in Northumberland County. The district attorney may or may not have filed late. That's being litigated in this cycle.
Now, you would think that if you're going to run for office, you would know exactly what you need to do to avoid ending up challenged and in court. Why don't people know this stuff? I mean, particularly the ones that get me are incumbents. If you're an incumbent, you have done a petition drive before. So why are you in court?
Well, you screwed something else up. I don't know what, but I have challenged a lot of incumbents, and the incumbents have gotten a lot smarter. They now have hired me to represent them prior to, the petition period. But there's a whole lot of reasons. I think it comes down to, you just kind of forget what you need to do, and that's could be fatal, as it could have happened to City Council President Clark 4 years ago. Like I said, he was within 15 minutes of getting bounced off the ballot. The challenge was never filed, but if it had been filed, he was dead on arrival.
Well, thank you so much for, sharing some of your time and your expertise with us.
Okay, glad to help.
And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right, Mr. Otter, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, you're welcome.
All
Last
right.
chance on a question.
Well, let me ask you this, though, really quick. So if the council president hadn't filed that form, would he still gotten on the ballot if there wasn't a challenge?
Yes, he was on the ballot, but if he had been challenged, he wouldn't have been on the ballot 4 years ago. Everybody knew that.
I see. All right. Well, Mr. Otter, thank you so much.
Okay, glad to help. Stay well.
All right. Have a good day. All right. I'd like to thank Mr. Larry Otter for being with us. And I'd like to introduce Denise Clay Murray.
Hi, everybody.
How are you, Denise?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. And we have some updates about what's happening, particularly in that 5th district.
Yes.
Particularly Council President Darrell Clark's preferred successor.
Yes. By this time tomorrow, there might not be anyone actually on the ballot in the 5th district. Apparently, everyone has been challenged, most notably Curtis Dickerson, Wilkerson, I'll be all right, who was Darrell Clark's chief of staff. He quit as chief of staff to run for city council to succeed his boss, and his petitions were incorrect. There are other petition hearings tomorrow, and from what my sources are telling me, the entire 5th, all the people who have, who wanted to run for 5th district, are probably going to get knocked off. If you remember from last week, J.P. Miranda, who was a state rep at one time before he got convicted for doing illegal stuff regarding staffing in his office, he took himself off the ballot because his petitions were being challenged. And let's face it, he probably wouldn't have been able to serve anyway because he had a felony conviction. But now it's looking like everybody's petitions are messed up in that race, which means that the person who wins that race will have to do so as a write-in candidate. And if you've ever seen write-in candidacies. I'll give you an example. When Maria Quinones Sanchez, who is now running for mayor, ran for her city council district the first time, she knocked her opponent off the ballot. Her opponent tried to get in and beat her as a write-in with fairly disastrous results. So a write-in candidacy, unless you have it really, really well organized and can do it correctly, is, just a recipe for disaster. And we're hearing that entire district may be a write-in.
And to complicate matters further, my understanding of the election law, and we'll double check this, but you would need the same number of valid write-in votes that you would need as signatures. So you would need 750 valid write-in votes.
Correct.
And that could be tricky because if you spell a name wrong, it's technically a different person until it gets rectified by a judge, which may or may not happen. There's all kinds of strange issues going on in the 5th District right now.
Oh, yeah. And you're asking 750 people to do a write-in correctly. And these are some of the same 750 people that you asked to sign your petitions. And you see how well that went. Yep. So, first of all, we're learning more about election law than we ever thought we'd need to know. But secondly, if you've been involved in city politics for as long as many of these people have, your petition should not be a hot mess like this. And yet here we are looking at a district that could be totally decided on a write-in vote.
Yeah. So
but I have some other news. One of the candidates for mayor, John Wood, who drew ballot position number 1 last week in the petition in the ballot position lottery, has dropped out of the race. Now, depending on who you talk to, now there are some gossip sites on the internet that are saying, oh, he dropped out because somebody cut a deal with him. I don't think that was the case. From what I'm hearing from more reliable sources is that the reason he dropped out is that he didn't live in Philadelphia long enough. Yeah. He lived in the suburbs until like a year or two ago. Then he decided to move into the city. And in order to run for office in the city, you have to live here a minimum of 3 years. And if you don't live here a minimum of 3 years, then you can't run. You got to wait until you have passed the 3-year residency requirement. Because his petitions weren't a problem, because people kept asking me, well, why is he still in the race? He's still in the race because no one's challenged him.
He wasn't challenged, no.
Right, he's still in the race because no one's challenged him. Warren Bloom is still in the race because no one's challenged him. You have all of these people like James DeLeon. They're still in the race because nobody challenged their petitions. Now, my assessment of that is no one found them important enough to challenge, or they think that by leaving them on the ballot, it will split up the vote just enough where you can do what Michael Nutter did when he became mayor. There were so many people running that it split up the vote so much that he was just able to slide in and be the candidate, for mayor, despite the fact that he wasn't the most popular guy.
So there's a ways to go in this before we even have a complete ballot. So now,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Denise.
I was saying to you last week, the ballot is going to be a mess until sometime at the end of March.
Yeah,
and I'm sticking by that based on stuff like we're hearing now.
Well, and there are challenges still for tomorrow and Friday, and you have 10 days after that. So this could conceivably go into April if somebody appealed the decision of the judge. So we might not even know next week where we are.
That's true.
So
That's very true.
yeah. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go from petitions and that process to what happens on election day and how we get there, right? So we spoke with Dr. Jeffrey Carroll, who is a professor at Chestnut Hill College, and he's done a lot of work on, and my camera just went away, but that's okay. He's done a lot of work on people who are experiencing poverty and their voting turnout. And he had some very interesting insights in that. And we're going to be talking to him more as we get closer to Election Day. But some of the things he said are really interesting. So here's our interview with Dr. Jeffrey Carroll. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're here to talk a little bit about voter turnout in areas experiencing poverty. But before we get to that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your research?
Oh, sure. My name is Jeffrey Carroll. I'm an associate professor of political science at Chestnut Hill College here in Philadelphia. And I'm also the chair for the Center for Data and Society. My research and scholarship is generally in American politics, and I have a special emphasis on urban politics and urban affairs, and a subset of that is in Philadelphia politics and public policy.
So one of the key things that we're talking about and studying right now for our program, for our newsletter, is the correlation between poverty and lack of voter participation. And this is something you've done a lot of work on. Can you tell us a little bit about that work? And particularly, there's one paper I wanted to reference that we've spoken about before that I think is particularly useful in this discussion.
Oh, sure. I think that it's worth stating that what has driven me into social science is this discussion about poverty in Philadelphia and in general. Personally, I believe that it's studying social science is a gateway to best understand the conditions in which we live, and with an eye to thinking about how things are changing and if there's possibility for improvement in society. I've asked a number of questions in this domain over time, everything from education to criminal justice reform. And lately, my work has been situated squarely on some basics of democratic institutions, especially as it relates to voting. So the questions that you are asking me is just ones that is what I think about all the time, and essentially keeps me up at night. I think the paper that you're referring to is the one that's on deep poverty and high turnout. It's a breakdown of the various wards and divisions and precincts of the city of Philadelphia, looking at the demographic changes in it, and then thinking about voting patterns. That's essentially the methodology of the paper. However, the implications and where that work and others like it have driven me to just think about the people in the neighborhoods, with an eye towards the civic engagement of Philadelphia, and specifically the voting engagement in Philadelphia and how to better it.
So why do we see a lack of participation in areas that are experiencing poverty? Because you would think voting and choosing elected officials is one of the tools in the toolbox to help get out of poverty, advocating for different positions, things like that. Why do we see that?
Certainly, I believe intuitively that logic is absolutely sensible. However, we've known for quite some time that there are a myriad of obstacles in which poor folk find it difficult to engage in the political system. And there are these big bucket categories that this falls in. What I'd like to say first about this topic is that essentially when we think about the experiences in which the impoverished go through, it's a mechanism of survival day after day. And for some folk, it's hour to hour. And to think about that in that way, certainly that voting matters and the conditions of their lives matter. But certainly this is on a higher plane than what is on the forefront of poor folks' minds. However, so there is certainly this just idea about the trust in government, the involvement in which this idea of political efficacy, excuse me, as it relates, excuse me, as it relates to poor people, but also the obstacles. For example, just getting to the voting booth takes so many steps in understanding the rules about how to navigate state agencies, when the deadlines are, thinking about once you walk in there who the candidates are, many of which get turned away because of so many procedures that are barriers placed in front of poor people, that are intentional for the most part in preventing groups of people to vote. So taken together, there are these personal explanations of why the impoverished don't vote there, and also too there are these institutional obstacles at that.
I'd like to bring in Denise here on Philadelphia Now.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll. We really appreciate it. You were just talking about the institutional barriers and how some of these things might be intentional in terms of keeping poor people away from the polls. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yes, of course. Particularly over the I would say the last decade, the purposeful call for voter suppression is happening here, not just in the city of Philadelphia or across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but across the United States. This is very malicious behavior on behalf of states and localities that have made a calculus of how people win elections, essentially, and wanting to prevent people from voting. And the people that are most vulnerable to that are people of color, and oftentimes also too impoverished because of this intersection of race and class. Now, before, we used to have these very overt mechanisms to just disenfranchise people to vote. We would have poll taxes and this idea that if your grandfather voted in an election, you can vote in an election. Well, of course, you know that there were times through history. Let's say you're the first one voting after the Civil War and after the 15th Amendment, getting the right to vote. Your grandfather didn't, of course, vote in those elections. Okay, it had to be codified into law, the right to vote, this Voting Rights Act of 1965, and essentially has been just this struggle since then to ensure that everyone, notwithstanding who they are, gets the opportunity to vote. But today, we don't have those overt mechanisms where there are poll taxes and there are literacy tests. Now it happens much more covertly. I believe that the crux of this is the debate, let's say, over voter ID. If implemented, it's study after study after study, and then places that have enacted a voter ID law have found that there is disenfranchisement, that meaning that people that show up to the poll and are inherently turned away from getting to vote. And then an extension of that study is who, again, people of color and poor people being disenfranchised. So that it could be one form of a mechanism that acts as a form of suppression. There are other kinds of malicious acts, such as moving a polling place, for example, as a means of not allowing somebody to vote. And at the federal level, we've actually walked back some of the provisions from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 via Shelby versus Holder, and this idea of pre-clearance, where the states had to actually have changes to their election law pre-approved by the federal government, which that Supreme Court case have actually disallowed that as of, I believe, 2013. So the environment in which to allow for voting suppression in the last decade has opened up and made it more amenable for this kind of malicious activity to happen.
Now, since we're still, kind of dealing with folks who don't believe that the last election actually happened the way it did, what part could that play in terms of poor people getting out to vote? The fact that you have people who are using election denial as a means of keeping people from the polls or saying they shouldn't be there.
Gosh, that is an excellent question, Denise. I believe that it does play a big role just in terms of political efficacy. Someone that is behooved to go vote and other kinds of political participation, let's say contacting their elected officials, even just paying attention to the operations of government and politics, warns that people are not turned off by the political process. And this idea of efficacy, it kind of waxes and wanes over time. But what I can say is that when there are times like this, of times of conflict, times in thinking of misinformation, times of untruths, these are very, very unsettling times, because what happens is that people, poor or not, begin to defect away from not only thinking about politics, but just not participating at all. So political participation will just wane. So I think that we are going to be studying these last couple of years for a very, very long time, for decades upon decades. Because the question that you asked is essentially that idea altogether about legitimacy, and accountability in government, and trust tied to someone's engagement with the system. And today, these are very, very unsettling times for that, where I believe that in terms of the citizenry, and particularly for poor folk, there are people that are not trusting at all, because it's driven by the thinking and then the experiences of that of behavior from our political elites that are turning off just swaths of people in our society.
Now, speaking of our political elites, right now we're going through a mayor's race, and I've been talking to some of the mayoral candidates as part of this effort that we're doing on poverty and voting, about going out on the campaign trail with them when they go into areas that have been more closely associated with poverty. If I had a nickel for everybody who's invited me to go to Kensington with them, I could have retired last month and been very happy. But a lot of the folks that folks are going to be asked to vote on this time around have not only been, elected officials for a long time, but in some cases have represented these neighborhoods that seem to be in intractable poverty. And they only seem to get to really see their elected officials when it's campaign time. Does that play a part in the disconnection between voter turnout and poorer communities?
Excellent question. I believe that it does. I think that this parallels to this idea of trust, doesn't it? Of folks, good folks in communities when there are problems. And I love this thing. Why I got into studying politics is and urban studies in particular is that all politics is local, right? It's that we can see when there's a pothole in our street. We can hear when there is a gunshot that goes off a couple of blocks away, right? We can experience, that when there is a nuisance bar on the corner where there's all kinds of activity, possibility of maybe violence happening in the middle of the night. And that idea is that these problems should be rectified, right? And that there is an attentiveness that needs to happen all the time and not just election time. But I would agree with that sentiment that folks, let's say these might be elected officials that represent the whole city or at-large candidates before they were running for mayor, where they represent the whole city, where I understand the sentiment from residents saying that they haven't been visible to me. I haven't seen you. I saw you. I may have seen you in 2019 or in 2015 or when there's an election or when you want us to vote. But these challenges are happening all of the time. And certainly it's that presence there in which citizens really do want constant visibility, and not just visibility, it's just attention in so many ways, attention that folks, elected officials, show up for forums to do problem solving, to do all of the to show up in the schools, right? To show up in the churches, right? To show up in the community centers, and on the playgrounds. And this is not during the times of just the ribbon cuttings or when there was a big event or they have some big sponsor that comes through. But for those things that are the little things but mean so much to us residents, right? The cleanups, because it's the opportunity to engage in that dialogue that will spill over to thinking about what are the other problems that are around and how can we best solve those problems and set up a foundation for communities to solve those problems, to be involved and participatory. And you can't be involved in participatory unless there's like true engagement, right? There has to be a foundation of trust that's there, that's built, and that's coordinated with our system of government, with the residents on the ground.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right, Dr. Carroll, where can people find more of your work?
You can find my work on my faculty webpage on Chestnut Hill College. There, I also have a personal website, JNCarroll, JNCARROLL.com, that has things like my CV, a summary of my scholarship, and my teaching and service contributions there too. I also am on LinkedIn.
All right, Mr. Otter.
All
right, we'd like to thank
Chestnut
Dr.
Hill College. I would be glad to link with you there.
All right, Dr. Jeffrey Carroll, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'd like to thank Dr. Carroll for being with us on the program. Denise, we only have a couple minutes left, so can you give us a preview of what we're going to be seeing in the newsletter on Friday? Oh, you're muted there.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
Well, I watched a little bit of the school district's candidate forum last night. And as most of these candidate forums do, it ultimately comes up to the subject of safety and gun violence and other things that don't necessarily mean anything to the topic at hand, but seem to be a point of discussion. So my column this week is going to focus on how, if we're going to talk about gun violence and how we solve it in the mayor's race or even in the city council races, we really need to be specific in what we ask. Because the last time we were not specific in what we asked of our government when it came to stopping a crime problem, you had a generation of people who ended up getting locked up for little bits of rock cocaine at the same level you would normally lock up drug kingpins.
Mhm.
So we have to be extremely specific in our ask, and I don't see people being specific enough in their ask, and I don't see any specificity on the part of the candidates in terms of answering these questions.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the culprit for this, in part, I think it is the fact that we have so many candidates in this race right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not conducive to the idea of having a forum where everybody gets 2 minutes to answer a question. You can't get into any specifics.
Not when you got 12 people.
That's right. And one of the things that I've said, I believe I've said it on the radio on this show, and we've discussed this privately. I don't think an answer to the gun violence question, if you ask that question in February, the answer is not going to change when we get to May.
No, it's not.
So I think instead of asking the question every time, I think it's more like take as much time as you want to tell us how you're going to do it and walk us through that, because that's what people need to hear. And it's not on anybody's website, really. You know, I haven't seen anything on a website. I would love to see the candidates make a video and they say, this is what I'm going to do. And if it's 20 minutes, it's 20 minutes. I'll watch the whole thing because I want to know.
Right. Right. Because it would certainly make more sense for you to do that than for you to do like a 2-minute spiel of nothing but buzzwords.
And, you know, we're doing that on this show with poverty. We're going to have we're going to have some stuff to release in a couple of weeks about some things we've been working on dealing with poverty and voting and those kinds of things. So look forward to that. But yeah, so that sounds good, Denise, and we'll be looking forward to that. Next week on the program, we will be joined by Liz Hirsch, the Director of Homeless Services here in Philadelphia, to talk about how the city is utilizing its funds to tackle the homeless problem here in the city. And our own Lance Haver will be with us to talk about and provide updates on SEPTA and the water rate hearings. So there's a lot of things that Lance is covering right now that we're going to talk about next week. Thank you all for being with us, and we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.